Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Between now and about 2:30, we're going to be asking, should the state play more of a role in the economy? I'm Liam Halligan. I guess I'm an economist. I was quite good at maths at school, but I didn't quite have the personality to become an accountant, I guess. And unlike the people on the panel at the moment, us economists, we're the kind of experts who don't know what we're talking about, but we like to make you feel as if that's your fault. What a brilliant session we just had. We had Dominic Cummings telling us, reporting from the front line, that the system is running the system and it's running it for itself. Pathological public sector behaviour he talked about, and a serious drop-off in talent. Andrew Adonis didn't demur, similarly frustrated. He said the state can act when it wants to, but the last time it really did act, in his view, was when we built the motorways in the early 1960s. And Michael Gove, no less, bemoaning the importance of fish welfare and the accommodation of domestic feline hunting habits when it comes to the provision of such necessities as shelter and energy. Do we really want the state to play more of a role? Tax in this country as a share of GDP is already at a 70-year high. We can't borrow more, even if your name's Liz Truss and you did work at the Bank of England. You still have to make sure the bond markets don't come back to bite you. I'm amazed how few at Westminster remember or even know about what happened in 1976. I'm not talking about Southampton winning the cup, though they did, or the long hot summer that I remember as a child. I'm talking, of course, about when the IMF Britain went cap in hand to the IMF, our economic suez, as I've labelled it. That is in recent history, and yet it's barely remarked upon. So what should the role of the state be in directing the economy, investing in the economy, in defence and infrastructure applications? Should the nation state play more of a role? That question was raised in an earlier session this morning. Do we really want to be in big blocks, giving up sovereignty to international bodies and groupings? And the state, anyway, it seems to me, domestically in crisis, with a loss of faith in institutions. I think we're going to have a very low turnout in this election. I'm sure many of you would agree with that. And internationally, the state seems to be in crisis, given big questions about the future direction of Western hegemony, and arguably the worst international environment since the end of the Cold War. And yet we have these models, don't we, about state-led success in Asia. Is that a cultural thing? Could it work here in the West? And of course, looming over all of this, the AI revolution. What role should the state play in that? What role should it play in the role of the state? Fantastic panel for you here. We've got Professor Richard Jones at the far end of Manchester University, Professor of Materials, Physics and Innovation Policy. Hilary Salt, actuary, business leader, and now a candidate for the SDP in the Northwest. I know she's shown a big interest in energy and industrial strategy. Next to Hilary, we've got Professor Marc Pennington, who of course runs the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. Sam Bowman, founding editor of Works in Progress, long association with the Adam Smith Institute, of course, a strong, thoughtful, pro-market voice. And then Marc Warner joins us, CEO and founder of Faculty, a leading voice on the role and potential of AI in government and well-versed in the niceties and realities of government procurement. So I've asked the panel to be brief at the beginning, quick intro, quick throat-clearing statement, then we'll have a discussion, but really I want to get you involved as much as we possibly can. There's so much expertise here in the room, and it's nice outside, so if we are going to be inside, let's make the most of it. Professor Richard Jones.
Great, thanks. So my answer to the question, should the state play a more active role in the economy, is, well, probably yes, certainly different, hopefully more effective. And just to stress, why do I say that? Because whatever we've been doing, it's not working. And people have mentioned already the productivity problem that we have. If productivity had grown at the same rate as it did before the GFC, we'd be 1/3 richer. You just have to imagine what kind of country this would be if we were 1/3 richer. We have regional economic inequality, and I'd focus on the underperformance of our second cities. Manchester and Birmingham have less than the productivity of the UK average, so we're getting no agglomeration benefits from them. That's really unusual by international comparators. And I do need to be a bit optimistic about Manchester, because that's where I've come from. And since we're talking about state capacity, I think it's just important to mention the importance of state capacity in city government too. And Sir Howard Bernstein died on Saturday. I think many people miss his enormous contributions to the city as a really effective public servant. The resurgence of central Manchester owes a great deal to him. And I think, we can take pride in the fact it's arguably the second centre of AI business in England. But those benefits still are not spread across all 2.8 million people of Greater Manchester, and that's still a long way away. But to come back to productivity stagnation, I think that started not at the global financial crisis, a bit earlier. I think economists do probably believe that. There's a consensus that that the central problem has been a lack of investment. And a particular type of investment I want to talk about is R&D, because that's what I think about a lot. It's a particularly forward-looking type of investment. There was a really significant drop in research intensity in the UK economy between 1980 and 2000. Anyway, everybody agrees we need more R&D, but why should the state be involved? Well, there's a very long-standing consensus, actually. It goes back to the Devonshire Commission of 1875, that the state should support research. And I could give you a kind of economist answer about that in terms of non-rival, partially excludable character of scientific knowledge. But I think it's interesting to look at the history. So in 1980, the UK was possibly the most R&D, well, it was as R&D intensive as any economy in the world. And what happened in the late 80s, there was a deliberate policy decision that the state should withdraw from applied R&D. It should just focus on upstream curiosity-driven research. So at that point, the defence research establishments were closed down. There was an end of research into energy technology. And I just thought I'd focus on one thing, because I know many people are interested. Nuclear power is absolutely at the intersection of these issues. And civil nuclear research was essentially completely run down. The only thing that was the exception was fusion. So Cullen was left there running, and it's run the Joint European Torus, MAST. And I think it's not a coincidence. The only place where we still have a substantial engineering and systems ability, skills base, that's the place where we now have a vibrant startup community in fusion. I contrast that with our complete failure to build a nuclear power station since 2008. And I appreciate the importance of fish, but I think that rundown of capacity has been really important. And we've also seen big private sector labs have been run down. ICI and GEC were essentially self-destructed in the late 90s, and that took out a huge amount of private sector R&D capacity. So far from state R&D capacity crowding out private sector R&D, both fell together in the 80s and 90s. So I think we need to rebuild that. We need to put the state's resources behind rebuilding private sector research capacity. That needs an increase in the state's own capacity. I think we understand the UK can't do everything. The UK is about 3% of the world's high-tech economy. In the words of the great historian David Edgerton, the UK is a big Canada, not a small USA. And, the idea of Juche UK is a complete non-starter. But we do need to think of some things that we can do. We do need to recover the ability to build complex, difficult things. What should we focus on? I think the obvious answer is those places where the state has a compelling need to develop capacity, and it should take much more direct control over. And two obvious ones are energy abundance. I absolutely believe that we need to be moving to a world of energy abundance, and national security. So I think the state is important. The state can create capacity for doing complicated technological things, and I think we need to rebuild that.
Richard Jones, thank you very much. Let's move on to Hilary Salt. Hilary, you're running for the SDP. I recently interviewed my friend Rod Liddle and asked him, who's a fellow candidate, of course, in his native Middlesbrough. You're running in Wythenshawe, I believe. And Rod said to me, the SDP, it's much more David Owen than Shirley Williams, and in its modern incarnation, and it's economically centre-left and socially centre-right. So what's the economically centre-left, socially centre-right view of the role of the state?
Okay, well, I think people would call us far left these days, I suspect. Yes, so I guess I wanted to, I will talk a lot about what I think the state should do, but I wanted to just begin with one thing where I think the state's interference has been really problematic, and that's in legislation around governance. And the two main issues, the two main examples of that are Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006 and the associated Corporate Governance Code, and Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010, which introduced the public sector equality duty. What both of those things do is to introduce vast layers of compliance into businesses. They encourage a herd mentality, they stifle competition and innovation, and you get businesses run by an army of non-executive directors whose focus is entirely on governance, risk reduction, and back covering, and definitely not R&D. And I think that's a real area where state intervention is really problematic, and we need to kick the state out of that role. But there are lots of areas where I think the state does need to play a role. So I agree we need to tackle the productivity problem. And I think that needs a rethinking of those frontiers between the state and the market, not to crowd out the market. I think the market's ability to massively increase living standards is something we need to leverage, not crowd out. But there are areas where the market on its own just does not work, and where state intervention, I think, is very much required. So we haven't had an active industrial strategy since the 1970s. And in that period, we've seen manufacturing fall from over a third of our economy to generously less than 10%. And to reverse that, I think we do need state intervention. Now, by that, I don't mean the state picking winners or propping up failing industries. In fact, I think the state needs to allow lots of our zombie companies to fail because they're a drag on overall productivity. But rather, I think the economic strategy needs to be built around a clear vision of what the nation is and the nation's goals and purposes. So an economic strategy needs a lot more than just economic thinking. It needs a democratic renewal where we rethink and debate what's important to us. So as an example, post-Brexit, there's been a lot of concentration on trade deals, bilateral or with regions. But for huge periods in the past, we successfully traded without those deals. And in fact, I think some barriers to trade are actually quite helpful in forcing local businesses to produce the best. If we make world-class stuff, other countries will want it, whatever the trade tariff. And I think actually we've seen recently with the tariffs on Chinese electric cars that, if you have that kind of grit in the system, it's a real encouragement to businesses to find ways to produce things better locally. So I think we need a democratic debate about whether the kind of neoliberal assumption that free trade is the only goal is right. Are there not areas where we want to secure our own supply of, for example, steel or food or energy? Are there areas where we do feel indifferent about a reliance on imports? And what do we want to do about our trade deficit? So we've not had a manufacturing trade surplus since the 80s. And to fund our trade gap, of course, what we need to do is borrow money or sell assets. Are we happy with that? And those are kind of real policy debates that I think we need to be having rather than kind of squabbling over next year's tax bill. Second, I think we need to think about how the state leverages the value we can create from our universities and our technical skills. Agree with the points Richard's made already. And I think that does mean rethinking education. We've got a massive over-provision of quasi-academic education, massive under-provision of technical skills, and government needs to be an enabler to help shape technical training and make sure that's harnessed by partnerships with industry and indeed with local government. Because I think the third aspect of this is we do need more regionalisation. And the role of government we need to think about today, I think, should be local government, not just central. It's wrong for Westminster or Whitehall to decide what's right for Bolton or Bradford. local communities know what works best for them. I was a great opponent of the metro mayors, but I've actually come round because I think they can play a real role in things like placemaking, making sure that we build not just new homes, but infrastructure and industry.
Is this an embryonic mayoral bid by you?
Not quite, not yet. You don't know I'm not going to win the election yet, Liam. So I think within the context of those principles, I think I would set 3 roles for the state. Some overlap here, which is good. The provision of cheap, reliable energy based on nuclear solutions. The renationalisation of utilities like water, energy and the railways. Since the pandemic, the railways are pretty much nationalised anyway. It's a fallacy to imagine you can create competition in those natural monopoly areas. And privatisation has not resulted in massive investment. We haven't built new reservoirs for decades, and certainly our northern rail is Victorian rail lines constantly patched up. So just one thing I wanted to say about the criticism people might have of this, which is where does all the money for this come from? I'm not being romantic about that. I think if you look at state finances, it's not that the spending isn't there. We spend huge tranches of money on mopping up problems and dealing with symptoms instead of investing in solutions. I think Liam will say that housing is a classic case where the capital budget is dwarfed by housing benefit and help to buy spending. So we've got a state that taxes, regulates and spends, but doesn't do things, is incompetent at building the infrastructure that we need. It cannot execute. And that's the weak spot I think we need to correct. We need to rebuild state capacity and confidence to procure, build and make things happen. But all that, I think, does still rely upon that reinvigorated public debate, which I'm hoping we can start today.
Hilary, thank you very much. A clarion call for the state. I think in this election, these questions of the role of the state, they're there, but they're not quite being debated. The SDP wants to nationalise the railways. Labour pretty much wants to nationalise the railways. GB Energy, a state-run body that is apparently going to be formed that invests in energy infrastructure without actually providing. Debates about whether the state should be packaging land for development because the private sector clearly doesn't seem to be providing all the houses that we need. And yet, the specifics of these issues rarely seem to break through in this election. What say you, Marc Pennington? State-owned railways?
I'm not going to talk about railways, but I am going to argue that the state should be playing a lesser role and a different role. So a free market economy is not and never can be a rules-free order. The question is what kind of rules that economy should be situated in. There are 3 principles, in my view, that we should follow. First, such an economy should be based on rules that allow for permissionless adaptation and permissionless innovation. People need space to be able to innovate and adapt to their own local circumstances. That requires strong protection of private property rights. Second, rules should reduce the transaction costs of decision-making. That means, where possible, confining decision rights to those who are immediately affected by a decision, a buyer and a seller, an employer and an employee. The rules should not grant veto power to multiple external actors who are not directly affected by the decision in question. Third, rules should be focused on addressing genuine externalities that impinge on people's property rights. It's not an externality when an incumbent loses market share to a new entrant, or when the value of houses falls because the supply of homes on the market has increased. It is an externality if someone pollutes the air without our consent, and it may be an externality when someone's view is threatened by a new construction project. When we deal with externalities, however, it's essential that we recognise they are double-sided, and therefore the rules must allow for bargaining between conflicting points of view. All of the principles that I've just outlined are violated by the biggest obstacle to UK economic growth, which is the UK town and country planning system. The right to develop land in the UK is nationalised, and it has been since the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, which is part of the Attlee government's socialist transformation project. You cannot have permissionless adaptation and permissionless innovation in the UK land use planning system. because with the exception of certain agricultural land uses, no decision can be made without the approval of a planning bureaucrat or a committee of stakeholders. The original aims of the land use planning system were to introduce something like what today is called missionary government in the direction of people and industry. That model was an abject failure, the legacy of which we still live with. If you look at the New Towns project, which is part of that whole enterprise, all of the new towns, with the possible exception of Milton Keynes, are behind on all the major socioeconomic indicators that people normally want to focus on. The only goal that the system has achieved is that of urban containment, containing the growth of the urban areas. It is entrenched a system of stakeholder veto power, where multiple actors can actually work to block development from taking place. The results should be very familiar to all of us. NIMBYism is rampant, and the supply of new development land doesn't keep pace with demand, and it hasn't done for close on 70 years. Between 1900 and 1930, with rising population and living standards, prices for development land fell. They fell. Since 1947 and the introduction of the Town and Country Planning Act, there has been a constant increase in the wedge between the price of land in agricultural use and the price that you get if you actually have planning permission for housing or any other kind of use. The effects of that are clear for everybody to see. We've got constantly escalating house prices, but the price of what you actually pay for your house, 90% of it is the land cost. The scarcity rents that are generated by the system mean that people spend disproportionately investing in the property sector rather than in industry as a whole. The quality of housing design is very poor because in a seller's market at the margin, developers are more likely to make money speculating on their ability to sell land with planning permission than actually competing on the design of the units that they sell. In a seller's market, you can put virtually anything and it will actually be sold. The planning system reduces competition. We have a system that is heavily dominated by big developers because once they have achieved planning permission, their interests are to block other developers from entering into the market. And finally, the planning system reduces adaptation to local circumstances. The area of green belt in the north of England, proportionately speaking, is greater than it is in the southeast. So you cannot have the agglomeration economies that you were talking about just a few minutes ago in a situation where places like Manchester and Liverpool are not allowed to get closer together. Now, I've focused on planning for one very specific reason. The kind of decision-making pathologies that the land use planning system exhibits are what you would expect if we move towards the two models of government which are now being proposed within the opinion-making classes. The planning system was an example of missionary government, and it illustrates the pathologies of such a system. If you introduce a massive program of land nationalisation and it turns out to be wrong, it proves very difficult to reverse it. Secondly, the land use planning system in the UK, you could say, is an example of stakeholder capitalism. It is an example of what you get when veto power is given to multiple actors who are not directly involved in any particular sort of decision. If we move in the direction of missionary government and stakeholder government in other areas, as we are doing, for example, in energy, expect all of the failures of the land use planning system that we have to be replicated in those areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. Good of you to focus on planning. I agree very much with you on the enduring legacy of the 1947 legislation. Let's bring that up in discussion. Before we do, let's move on to Dr. Marc Warner, co-founder and CEO of Faculty. Off you go, Mark.
So I'd like to tell you a real story about the state's role in the economy. So one absolute no-brainer piece of national infrastructure is euphemistically called wastewater surveillance. It's actually monitoring of sewage for disease. And it might sound a bit gross and dull, but it's actually extremely cool. So during COVID, in a big collaboration, along with many others, we built a system that pulled sewage from several hundred locations across the country, tested it for COVID DNA, and predicted how many people were going to turn up in hospital later on across the entire country. Now, I know there's a tendency to overclaim about where the UK is actually world leading, but because it was COVID and because we were sharing learnings with all the countries around the world, we knew exactly where the US, Singapore, Israel, Europe were. And it was very clear that our system was the best in the world. And that was just the start. So such a system would let you measure all known infectious diseases continually across the whole country and spot new infectious diseases when they arose. It would have allowed proper testing of public health interventions. And we could have built a public health forecast that would sit alongside the weather forecast and the pollen forecast on the news every night so that people could have made better choices about their health across the entire country. This would have been like a piece of national infrastructure like the motorways or the Met Office. And the prototype was built. So what happened? Well, immediately after COVID, the government closed it down. We tried very, very hard to stop that happening, and ultimately there was nothing we could do. About a year later, then, the government procured for a strategy project to figure out whether the thing we'd already built was possible. We won that procurement, we did the work, and lo and behold, the thing that we'd already built turned out to be possible.
But what about the fish?
So then somebody needed to build the thing that we'd already built. So to make this procurement fair, the government said that we weren't allowed to use any of the people who'd worked on the last project, the strategy project, or the actual build, as part of writing our bid. So we, in fact, lost that procurement. Not on quality. Our bid was the best on quality, despite the people having never worked on any of this before. We'd had to take them from an entirely different part of the business. But we lost it on price because some big consultancy bought the work by underpricing us at half their normal rate because they knew that UK HSA was one of the few places that was actually spending and they needed a way in there. So now someone else was trying to build the thing that we'd already built based on the strategy that we'd written at a totally uneconomic cost. How do you imagine that worked out? That failed, and so it got reprocured. Now we won the procurement to build the thing we'd already built according to the strategy we'd already written 4 years later with none of the continuity that would have actually let us build a business around this. Now, that probably will be a small and relatively successful project somewhere vastly diminished from the ambition of what it possibly could have been. But where does that leave the UK? Well, we don't have this powerful system to protect our health. We are now behind the US and Israel in the technology, and there is basically no commercial benefit to the UK PLC in general. So what do I learn from this? Well, the first thing to say is that there are like billion-dollar opportunities lying in the street. There are properly real moments where the state has needs for things that can benefit the economy and generate great businesses. But as currently structured, our state is almost completely incapable of exploiting these. And so when we go to the question, should the state play more of a role in the economy, I think it's kind of obvious to me that an ideal state should intervene. And it should focus primarily on the no-brainer wins of using government procurement to drive strategic advantage, but should consider other ways it might do more. But should our actual state, as it is in reality right now, intervene in the economy? I think that's much more complicated. We don't have the state capacity to do it well, and we should be quite careful. For me, the state should help the economy by focusing on the foundational things, some of which have already been mentioned: cheap energy, better planning, and civil service reform. And then once we've proven we can accomplish even those total, no-brainer foundational things, we can move on to the more difficult types of state intervention.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Finally, Sam Bowman.
Great, thanks very much. When you're a second-hand dealer in ideas like me, you're constantly looking for product market fit. You have lots of things that you think the state should do, lots of things you think the country should do, and you're constantly trying to craft them in a way that appeals to the people in power and makes them feel that the things that they want to do line up with the things that you think they should want to do. So I am not going to do that to you. I was planning on coming in and saying, well, industrial policy is actually all these great things that we should be doing anyway. We just need to think about it differently. And I will finish by talking about that and kind of sharing my product market fit idea with you. But rather than treating you as consumers, I'm going to treat you as conspirators or collaborators. Because we should start from the very, very clear point that industrial policy is a very, very, very flawed approach as we traditionally understand it. In all discussions of industrial policy, there's a gigantic amount of survivorship bias. We talk constantly about South Korea's shipbuilding industry and South Korea's shipbuilding programs, but never about Brazil's completely failed, wasteful, disastrous attempts to do the same thing. We talk about the Chinese tech industry, but we never talk about France's attempt to build a rival to Google or the European attempt to build rivals to AWS and Google Cloud. Because there is this survivorship bias, we only see the successes, and we imagine that it's easy to transplant the things that have worked into our state. I think a second thing, as an aside, that we forget is there seems to be what you might call an East Asian fixed effect. East Asian countries seem to be remarkably good at doing things no matter what they try to do. Even communist countries in East Asia are incredibly wealthy and growing very rapidly. Vietnam and China are communist countries and have much, much stronger growth than countries in Latin America that are doing, I would say, much better things as we would objectively judge, whatever your views are, objectively judge them. So I think we have to be very careful not to fall prey to this idea, the kind of East Asia fallacy, that we can just do whatever Taiwan does or do whatever South Korea does without a problem. Because when we look at the UK state, as both of the Marcs have talked about, we see that it is incredibly inept at doing the things that every sensible person would want it to do. Not the things that we might debate about, not things around industrial policy, just the really basic things like providing infrastructure, allowing things to get built that want to get built. It's incredibly prone to rent seeking. Virtually everything the UK government does is incredibly dependent on information from corporations and non-profit lobby groups, both of which have very, very strong incentives that I think are often very divergent from the interests of British citizens and from the interests of the British state. We see this problem, by the way, in the United States as well. TSMC's plants in Arizona have been riven with problems around the use of union labor because the Biden administration isn't just trying to build a chip industry domestically, it's also trying to do one that is coherent with DEI policies, one that's coherent with its pro-union policies, it's building the plants in important swing states. All of these things stem from a chronic inability across Western governments to focus on one thing. For governments and the departments within governments to just focus on the thing that they are supposed to do, which is why when we talk about housing, we have to talk about net zero, and we have to deal with windows regulations that are about insulation, rather than just building houses that people want to live in, that are affordable for them to live in, that are in places they want to live. When we talk about industrial policy and research and development, we have huge amounts of spending on research and development in the UK. We had UKRI, a completely bloated, overblown mess that is now, I think, one of the huge failure points within the British state because we made a huge mistake in uniting all research funding under a single umbrella and created this incredibly brittle point that I think is breaking because a few people have gotten into positions of influence within it and are, I think, completely corrupting how it works. We have something called Innovate UK. If anybody has ever had to deal with Innovate UK, then I have very much sympathy for you because it's a completely broken institution. It should be shut down. But that is our attempt at industrial strategy. And I remind you, we have an industrial strategy. We have our modern industrial strategy set up by Theresa May in 2017 and 2018, which was completely abandoned by the next government, which is another problem, which is inconsistency. If you want to do these things, you need to have consistency, which we don't have. Now, this sounds like this is a contingent problem. This sounds like this is a thing, okay, well, what if we just get better at these things? But that is assuming that's a nirvana fallacy. It's assuming the best possible version of a state and imagining what that could do and trying to build around that nirvana instead of looking at the state we actually have and looking at the problems we actually have. I think any discussion of industrial policy, and this is where I'm going to get on to the pitch, really. This is what industrial policy should be, which is looking at the actual problems we have that businesses in the UK actually have. Number one, energy prices have tripled since 2004. No conversation about industrial policy that does not start with that fact is serious. If you're not talking about the cost of energy in the UK and the direction of the cost of energy in the UK, you are not serious about industrial policy. You're just a hobbyist. You're just somebody who wants to set up new institutions. Number two, we've talked about planning, mostly in the context of housing, but lab space is incredibly scarce. And lab space isn't just important because of the cost of research, it's important because of the type of research. Researchers who are faced with scarce lab space have to focus on the sure bets, the things that they have funding for, that are low variance types of research, that might make incremental improvements, but very rarely lead to big breakthroughs. When researchers have abundant lab space and abundant resources, they can parallel path lots of different projects and use spare time to do the big bet research that they would never be able to get funding for, but they do in their spare time because they're passionate about it and because they believe in it. You get that in Boston, Cambridge, Silicon Valley. You get that in places where lab space is abundant because researchers can afford to do it and they have the space to do it. We cannot do that here. We don't do that here. That is a much bigger problem. That we have other things around tax that I'm not going to go into. What I would suggest is when we talk about and think about industrial policy, instead of focusing on the extremely trapdoor decisions, by which I mean if we get it wrong, we have made a big mistake. And by the way, the cost of industrial policy and the cost of mistaken policies in this area is not the money that we spend on these things. It's the resources and people that we divert to the wrong things. It's not that we're just spending a few £1 billion. We know we waste hundreds of billions of pounds in this country. It's not a big deal to waste a couple of extra £1 billion. The big deal is wasting the most talented people in the country on projects that turn out to be not worthwhile. So I would suggest that instead of trapdoor policies, we focus on no-regrets policies. Policies where it doesn't actually matter if it turns out that AI isn't the next big thing. It's actually quite good to have data centers built anyway. It's actually quite good to have cheap energy anyway. It's actually quite good to let people build houses in places like London anyway. And rather than focusing on specific sectors and picking winners in that way, we try to do broad things, which again lead us to the no-regrets policies. I think there is a very simple way to package these things in a way that appeals to the current intellectual climate. I think I could do that. I'm not going to do that here. But I think people who are interested in fixing the real problems in the UK economy, which are about the fundamentals, the basics, really we have to do a marketing exercise to repackage our ideas in a way that appeals to the current climate, rather than, I think, trying to emulate countries that have failed many times and are gigantically bigger than us, and so can fail in ways that we don't really see.
Thank you very much, Sam. Huge number of issues. I want to get all of you involved as quickly as possible, so I'm just going to ask one question of each of the panelists, and then hopefully we can move on to questions along the lines of energy, net zero, then transport, then planning, just to try and keep a bit of focus. Let me just start by asking you, Professor Jones, you mentioned in your defence, if you like, of the role of the state that state R&D hasn't crowded out private sector R&D, but does it crowd it in?
I think the answer to that question is it could crowd it in. But, you know, it all comes down to, what kind of research you're doing, where you're doing it, what it's about. I thought the example of fusion, I think, is a really good one because R&D, you need, you do need labs, you do need cheap energy, but you need capability, you need people who understand things, you need companies that can supply the components to things. Culham, as I say, Culham's like a little fossil, a little remnant of the post-war, Cold War defence state, where it had that capability was there. And from that has emerged this quite vibrant ecosystem of private sector funded fusion companies, many of which, they're trying different approaches. They may well do it quicker than the state. But the important thing is to have that capability. So I think it's really important to focus on this idea of capability. You've got to have people. You've got to have companies that can supply the components. You've got to have a way of building big firms from little ones. So, there's plenty of, you could quite easily, the wrong investments could absolutely crowd out private sector investment. But I guess the point I'd come back to, though, is, just look at history. It didn't happen. We had a theory that if we stopped doing this stuff, then the private sector would step in. The private sector didn't step in. The private sector stepped away. And that was the period at which, we lost a huge amount of capability. We lost an electronics industry. The most vibrant and important industry of the, from 1990 to 2010. You know, we just kind of gave it up.
Indeed. Hilary, let's come to you. The SDP's policy on nuclear is clear. You want more nuclear power, though you like some status solutions. You're concerned about the huge planning regulations that surround civilian nuclear power. Are you concerned, by the way, that this is a country, we invented civilian nuclear power, right? And yet now all our power stations, all our nuclear power stations, they are built by a government, but just not our government. They're built by EDF.
Yeah.
Does that bother you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just our nuclear power stations. You know, if you look at things like our train service, my train service is run by an Italian organisation. You look at the Royal Mail, that looks like it's going to be run by a foreign organisation as well. And all that does bother me. But I think lots of these things don't have very short-term solutions to them, because I think a lot of these issues that we're facing do require not just a economic or a business response, but they require a political response. So we have to think as a nation, we have to debate as a nation what we want our nation to be able to do and what we don't want our nation to be able to do. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think is, when it talks about, you know, the state spending on things, when people imagine that the state has got out of all these things, so, you know, you say that the state's not involved in any of these things anymore, it's often involved in, its tentacles are right there in the form of regulation. And so we have a whole regulatory system in many of these industries where, you know, the government, the regulator is duplicating work being done by the industry. And then there's a huge element of discussion and debate and negotiation between two people who are doing exactly the same amount of work, the same work. And that's bonkers, you know. So I think we need to recognise and kind of almost have a balance sheet. You know, where is the government spending money on that industry? If you're going to spend government money on that industry, how is it best spent? Thank you, Hilary. Marc, for you, if I may, what's your vision of how the state can help to break this house building impasse, this planning impasse? Let's just think, back in the late 70s, a third of all people lived in state-owned housing in this country, post-war high. It's now 13%. But during the years when the state was heavily involved in the house building industry, both building houses itself and then, you know, contracting the private sector to build lots of social housing, a role now that housing associations almost entirely do. Lots of housing associations who seem to me to act more like hedge funds rather than the charities they should be. But during those state-heavy years of the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, at least we got the homes built. We've left it largely to the private sector.
We didn't. I mean, this
okay, well, we'll build a lot more homes than we did then. We built 3.1 million houses in the 60s. We built 2.7 million houses in the 70s. In the noughties, we built 1.3 million. And then from 2010 to 2020, we built 1.1 million. So as the state has retreated, the amount of houses, I'm being devil's advocate, that have appeared has been far less.
Well, in the 1930s, when we didn't have huge public housing, there was massive private house building.
Sure.
And that was the period when land
I grew up
prices
in
were
Metro
actually
Land.
falling.
All about it.
It is true that there was more development in the 60s and 70s when you had council housing. One of the reasons for that is that the state doesn't apply the rules it applies to the private sector to itself. It's more likely to sort of override the rules. Now, whether you want that as a basic principle of government, I'm not sure. But fundamentally, what's wrong with the planning system is that it doesn't allow for proper bargaining. If you have a top-down system that tells people to accept planning targets, they'll resist it. What you need is for people who are NIMBYs, and there's nothing wrong with being a NIMBY if you want to protect your view or whatever it may be, you need to give those people an incentive to take into account the fact that there is a cost still stopping development from happening. And I think that requires introducing compensatory mechanisms, where you pay people basically to accept development going ahead. The other thing that you can do, or I think need to do, which kind of introduces an element of that, is to have local government finance reform. Unless you have local authorities that raise more of their own revenue, they have no incentive to have development coming into their area. And that's a huge reform to take in itself, but I think it's absolutely fundamental that we need local accountability, that people are accountable for refusing development and for accepting it.
Of course, one way to do this is land value capture that's used around the world. The UK is fundamentally an outlier, isn't it? I know from your own work that there's been a lot of discussion of this in the department under Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State. The Labour front bench have got their whole land value capture mechanism. They're going to go back actually to the 47 Act, where the whole of the value uplifts. When agricultural land is given planning permission, it often goes up not 2 or 3 times, but 200 or 300 or even 400 times on the price. That land value uplift is captured and used in many other countries, including parts of the United States, Hong Kong. Hong Kong was built on these kind of land value capture gains. The Town and Country Planning Act gave the whole of that uplift in Attlee's New Jerusalem to the state, which meant that lots of land didn't come forward, and so you had many, many CPOs used. Ray Davis wrote about it in Sunday Afternoon. The lyrics are all there, if you're into the kinks. Labour, in the 61 Act, basically took the whole of the gain and gave it back to the landowners, sort of feudal system that exists to this day, and Labour want to reverse that completely and go back to 100% going back to the state. Something I think would just lead to more CPOs, and my proposal is to split it 50-50, and I know a lot of housing experts have agreed with that. Do you think there's any chance that could happen in the UK? You look at this very, very closely. What are the barriers to us doing what pretty much every other developed country in the world does, not just in Europe, but in Asia and the Americas as well, using this land value capture, using the uplift, giving it to the community, the local authority, and saying, if you accept these houses, there will be a new school, there will be a new hospital, there will be a new bypass, and we'll knock 50% off your council tax for the next 5 years, because that's what land value capture can do.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I don't think you can't separate that out from the local government reform. So local authorities must be responsible for raising more of their own revenue. If you have a situation where, which is what we have, basically 80% of what local authorities spend comes from central government rather than they raising themselves. They've got very little incentive to actually want development in the area. If they were raising their own revenue and they could have this kind of land value capture or part of it that could be shared between the community groups, I mean, I would even decentralize it to something like parish councils even, and the developers, then that would be a real step forward. But that's a massive task that maybe Andrew Adonis could take it on, or somebody, I don't know.
I'm working on it. Mark, let's just hear from you in terms of your AI expertise. To what extent do you think AI can change the potential of the state to do good? And how geared up are we for the AI revolution, this country of ours that produces very few semiconductors? Pretty important in AI.
That is definitely important. But there are plenty of, it's only semiconductors are only, or cutting edge semiconductors are only built in Taiwan. So every country has a similar lack of them. And, we do have ARM, and they're not a AI hardware manufacturer, but we are somewhat better placed than others. So, the short answer is the state is, basically nowhere on AI. It's still struggling with the kind of more basic digital revolution, and that is hard to change. All the things that have been, sort of hinted at perhaps, but it's really, there are really, really crazy salaries being paid in the AI world nowadays. A sort of, let's say, 5-year experience, top quartile machine learning engineer in Silicon Valley can get $4 or $5 million a year salary. Now, those people, you have to offer those people really, really a very powerful mission to get them. Admittedly, London salaries are not that, but nevertheless, you have to offer those people a real sense of mission if you want them to come into the public sector, and some sensible salary. Now, the AI Safety Institute, to its enormous credit, has actually managed to build probably the best technical team, maybe anywhere in any part of public government, anywhere in the world. So that is actually a bit of a triumph. But the problem is AI safety is or at least the type of AI safety they're doing, which is very focused on the frontier models, is like roughly isolated from the rest of government business. If you actually want to use AI to kind of transform the NHS or transform Home Office or prisons or whatever, you're then back into the nightmarish bureaucracy that's being talked about in a bunch of different places, the nightmarish procurement rules. And so it's like extremely hard then to do anything serious at scale.
But to, useless journalists like us, present company accepted, is AI something that could lead to a fundamental reduction, say, in the number of civil servants with their very expensive pension schemes and endless holiday entitlements and endless working from home demands that really annoy a lot of the rest of us? Could the civil service get smaller and still do a good job, or do a good job with AI?
I mean, I think the civil service could get smaller and still do a good job without AI.
Sure.
Like, I don't think we need to go that far.
But could it really revolutionise how we deliver public services, both in the public and the private sector?
For sure.
Because lots of us have heard of it and we read about it, but we're not practitioners like you.
Yeah, so maybe a couple of little examples. One piece of work that we've done is to help teachers do lesson planning. So they spend, I think it's 20% of their time planning lessons. That is time that they can't spend with the kids actually trying to educate them. But lesson planning is slightly individual. It's context dependent. Teachers find it hard to just take PowerPoints off the shelf and find them useful. And so we built a tool that takes like a very large, it's actually for a private company, but a very large corpus of lesson plans and helps a teacher develop a lesson plan to the teacher's specific instructions for that specific class, for the age group, for the subject, blah, 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 alongside a bunch of tests, and then can automatically mark the answers. And so in that kind of regard, there's no question that you could find that. I mean, we do the same thing with nurses to help them deal with the bureaucracy of patients moving through hospitals. We could do the same thing with a bunch of the forms that exist in the Home Office and whatever. So it's definitely a possibility, but I wouldn't I guess the reason I'm slightly negative about it is because I don't think AI will compel a department to make the changes necessary. If they're not going to make the changes without AI, they're not going to make them with AI either.
Sam, finally to you before we open it up for questions. Please have some questions ready. As somebody who's spent a long time, if I may say so, despite your relative youth, knocking around the Adam Smith Institute, somebody who follows politics very, very closely, I know. How have we gotten to a position where the state is already at a 70-year high in terms of tax take as a share of GDP, and yet there's pretty much a consensus across the parties, almost an acceptance, that the state's going to get bigger still? How's that happened? Was it lockdown? Was it something else?
I think that we're very downstream of the US. I think most people here are very, very influenced, including myself, including probably everybody in this room, very influenced by the debate in the US. And because of the threat of China, as we were talking about yesterday, the relevance and the desire for industrial policy, tariffs, protectionism has a very different dimension in the US that makes it probably a lot more pertinent there. And I think a lot of people see that. The US is a very successful economy. It's grown much more rapidly over the past 15 years. I mean, we've barely grown at all. So I think that's probably one reason. I think it's very, very much the case that we have a completely broken economic system, largely because, I think, of the planning system. I think there are lots of things that are broken. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. But I think most of the UK's problems would seem a lot more tractable if we solved the planning problem, because we have we can just look at the price system. You can almost print money. You talked about land value uplift. You can almost print money if you build houses within London. It's kind of unbelievable. We're effectively Saudi Arabia, but instead of oil wells in the desert, we just need to build houses in Islington. We have this ability, but we're prohibited from doing it. And the downstream effects of that are both the kind of general economic problem of agglomeration. One estimate says that just a random person, can increase their income by about 17% if they move from a kind of low-density, kind of outlying village town to somewhere like London. The aggregate effects are much greater than that, because it's not just that you kind of add a person to a shop, it's that you get much more combinations of people, unorthodox combinations of people, and those are the things that lead to great startups, great innovations, and great ideas. I do want to say one thing that I wish we were more downstream of the US on, and I'm broadly supportive of. I think R&D spending is a great thing. I think there are huge positive externalities from the state spending money on R&D, and I think Richard's done some brilliant. I was saying yesterday, if we have to have an industrial policy, I hope Richard is the person running it. I think he's an absolutely brilliant scholar and thinker. One thing I wish the UK debate was more influenced by the US on is discussion of how we spend R&D money and how we fund research, especially pure research. Some of the people I work with in the US are very focused on how R&D spending, specifically money for science, corrupts scientists' incentives and forces them to publish things that are not particularly useful, forces them to spend huge amounts of money on grant applications, huge amounts of time, as much as half of their actual working time on grant applications and follow-ups rather than doing research. And there's a huge amount of thought in the US about how we can do that differently. So, for example, maybe we just sort of randomly give out money to projects. Maybe we just give money to researchers rather than to projects and just say, do what you're passionate about and we'll come back in 15 years. I think ARIA is a very, very impressive and very, I think, promising attempt to do something like that in the UK, but ARIA's budget is tiny compared to the overall research and development spending we do here. So I wish we were a bit more skeptical of not just saying, okay, it's great to fund R&D, but thinking about how we fund R&D and whether the ways in which we fund R&D are, in fact, drawing talented people away from the things that they would like to do and they should do towards things that sound great if you're at UKRI or if you're at Innovate UK, but actually aren't particularly meaningful for science or for the things that are downstream of science at all.
Sam, thank you. Right, let's get some questions from the audience. Maybe let's get some questions first on energy/net zero. The state is telling us that we can't buy new petrol and diesel cars after 2035, after 2030 in the European Union. It'll go back to 2030, apparently, if Labour wins the election. And yet, when I talk to car industry CEOs off the record, they're really concerned about, they worry, have we got the right technology here? Crikey, we need lots of rare earths for all these batteries, and we haven't got the rare earths. Is this really the right thing to do? Who wants to talk about energy and net zero? Who's going to dare to talk about that? I know you can talk about anything, Sam. the lady there, and we'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, look, we've covered a lot of the state's limitations. I think we can probably agree on that. But actually, what about the kind of opportunities to integrate systems thinking into a lot of what we're doing? Because that's actually one of the things that the state can try and do better. I'm not saying it does it, but actually it allows us to build probably a stronger energy system, to go to your net zero point, but probably across a number of the issues that have been covered just now.
But how does it make you feel as a citizen of the UK, to Sam's point, that you're currently paying for your electricity, well, a lot more, the numbers obviously change every day, but than people in the US say? We're paying a lot more for our electricity than pretty much any other major European economy, and that applies to firms as well as households. Does that concern you?
I mean, as a business, yeah, energy prices are always an issue, but also we have quite a different mix, right? In the US, so we were quite exposed to the gas price cycle at the time. And there's no way that our energy about how diverse energy supply.
What's your thoughts on this, Hilary? How's the state getting on in terms of keeping our energy secure, keeping our energy keenly priced so we're not unduly lacking in competitiveness?
Yeah, so was it Jim Ratcliffe was saying last week that energy is 5 times the cost here to other places where he can do business. And clearly when you've got that kind of a difference, businesses can't compete when they're in the UK. So, I mean, I'd argue really strongly that a secure and reliable supply of energy has got to be the thing on which we build a reindustrialisation of Britain. And without that, we just can't do it. And obviously, renewables need to form part of that. But I would say the issue with net zero is that it's kind of taken a completely arbitrary target, and then we are loading in costs into our systems to meet that arbitrary target, which nobody's ever really explained to me why they've chosen that one. So, I think the state has a real important role in saying that we have to have that cheap energy, and cheap energy not just for businesses but for consumers as well. Because, I would say, one of the things I have met all the time on the doorsteps over the past couple of weeks is the cost of living crisis. People are really concerned about that. And a big part of that is energy, not just explicitly energy, but the impact of energy feeding through into the prices of everything else. So, I think that has to be the bedrock on which we rebuild Britain.
So just a reality check in some sense. Even the Climate Change Commission, the government's statutory in-house conscience, if you like, to make sure it does things that move us towards net zero, even the Climate Change Commission acknowledge that oil and gas, which currently accounts for 70-odd% of our energy, not electricity generation, if you include transportation, even they acknowledge that if we get to net zero by 2050, with lots of Panglossian assumptions about how renewables are going to deliver, even the Climate Change Commission says we're going to be using oil and gas for around 30% of our energy, even at net zero. And yet, a lot of the small energy companies in the North Sea, heavily loaded on debt, it's not the oil majors anymore, it's little companies, they can't operate at a 75% windfall tax because all their projects become unviable. And now Labour want to introduce a proper windfall tax. Richard?
Yeah,
What do you think of that when you hear politicians saying, "Oh, we can raise all this money from a massive windfall tax"?
Yeah,
I speak to somebody who wants to move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah,
it just seems mad if we need the oil and gas anyway.
I think the scale of the energy transition is not appreciated by the political class.
Yeah.
It's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that I would say is a really key date for the UK is 2000. That's when North Sea gas, North Sea oil production peaked.
Yeah.
And then we became a net energy importer around 2005.
Yeah.
I think we don't appreciate how much we were living essentially in a fool's paradise between about 1990 and 2010, where we didn't have to worry about energy anymore. We were a net energy exporter. Fossil fuel prices were cheap. And I say it's not a coincidence that that's the time when we basically ran down energy technology R&D to zero. We do know that we can really drive down the cost of different forms of energy really dramatically, by incremental technology improvement. You have to just look, the exponential fall in solar energy prices. It's not nothing to do with the UK. It's a combination of Germany providing a giant demand signal, China shoving in loads of free capital to get to corner the market in solar. But, the costs have fallen to a degree that, I was thinking about solar in 2010 quite a lot. I was actually working on alternative photovoltaics. We had no idea how much the cost of solar cells would fall. But you've got to start, you've got to do things. I'm quite convinced that we could, the price of nuclear, we could drive down in the same way that the Koreans are about the only people who've actually done it, by the way.
Lobby.
But
they like their high strike prices, don't they?
You just actually have to do things to succeed. You have to actually start things off, get better at it, drive the cost down, get the technology incrementally better. I don't see the urgency of that at the moment.
I thought for a moment you were talking about Gareth Southgate's England, but anyway, young lady there.
Hi. My name's Raphael. I'm a PhD student at Yale University. My question deviates a little, but it still stays on topic with revenue and spending, and it relates to tax policy. You mentioned windfall tax, but broadly, my question is going to pertain to economic inequality, specifically tax system fairness. So, And I'm not talking sort of within income tax, I'm talking between everyday taxpayers, domestic firms on one side, and then wealthy individuals and multinational corporations on the other. And you actually see in lobbying documents, domestic firms banding together, calling for increased tax transparency against multinational firms. It's estimated about 10% of the world GDP is lost to tax avoidance annually. That's about $250 billion. So my question to you is, how does the state play more of a role in tax reform broadly? Thank you.
Sam, that's made for you. Is that 10% number avoidance and evasion, or avoidance? Avoidance, okay.
Shifting revenue to tax havens.
Within the law, just to be clear.
So there's actually a funny grey area now. It's called tax evasion. That's sort of hybrid between avoidance and
Finnish
evasion.
or something, I can...
It's technical, and there's like various
wouldn't
international
understand
tax
it's technical,
reforms
then.
now that are trying to close that down.
Okay.
But it's this disparity that now exists where multinational firms have an effective tax rate sometimes of 0%,
Yeah,
while
especially the
domestic
tech guys.
firms have to pay the statutory tax
Yeah.
rate. So there's this disparity. And so I guess that's my question to you. Like, if we're talking about state capacity, that's not too dissimilar to tax capacity. Thank you.
Do you want to talk to that, Sam? And also bringing in Labour's policy, it isn't talked about much, but it is one of their kind of clap lines that they're going to put a tax on the tech giants in order to try and level up the high street, if you like, so bricks and mortar retailers aren't at as much of a disadvantage.
I'm not going to talk about a tax on tech giants because I don't want to have a conflict of interest.
Okay.
I do want to talk about tax reform. I'm not going to talk about tax evasion and tax avoidance because I don't know very much about it. The problem that I think that we have with tax in the UK is that we tax an awful lot of things that are good, and we don't tax things that are either bad or less good. So to give you an example, stamp duty. If you buy a house in London for £1 million, which is an expensive house but not a wildly expensive house, basically a family home within zone 3 or 4, your stamp duty bill now will be about £50,000. Anytime you want to move, it will be about £50,000 if you're just moving horizontally. It's a transaction tax. Every time you move, you're hit with it. It's different to something like VAT or capital gains tax, which only tax the value add or the uplift. It hits you every time you move. So people basically are trapped in the houses that they live in. That's a huge impediment to moving, and it means that the existing housing stock that we've got is massively misallocated. You end up with older people stuck in houses that are probably too big for them, that have spare rooms. You end up with younger people being stuck in houses that don't have enough rooms for them to have the children that they would like to have, and you end up with people not being able to move across town or move across cities for jobs because we tax that transaction. That's a huge, huge mistake. Up until very recently, and I think one of the really great things this government did was changing corporation tax to make it such that when businesses invest in capital, so machinery and things like that, they can deduct that cost from their tax bill in the same way they deduct the cost of labour, pens and paper, computers and things like that. Up until about a year ago, that you couldn't do that. You had to depreciate it over the notional lifespan of the thing, which meant that in actual real terms, you only really got to deduct about 70% of the cost of the investment. So you were taxed, effectively, as a business for investing in machinery. Now, we have changed that. That was, I think, the government's not going to get a lot of credit for changing the corporation tax base, but I think it was an incredibly good thing to do and quite a costly thing to do, and I'm very glad they did. But there are tons of things like that we are taxing, things we want people to do. We want people to move around. We want people to invest. We want businesses to invest. When we should move away from that kind of taxation towards a taxation of consumption, and specifically the consumption of the rich. And we can do that pretty easily. We can do that actually by the income tax system if we're willing to make ISAs more generous. There are ways of doing this that effectively allow us to turn income tax into a consumption tax without anybody really noticing. Unfortunately, we're moving the other way. I think the Labour government is quite likely to put a cap on ISA pot sizes, which will mean that actually ISAs can't provide this. But we can move towards what is called a progressive consumption tax, where the consumption of the rich is taxed very, very highly. 60%, 65% if you want. I wouldn't go for that, but it's not a million miles from where we are already. But if they invest their money, we're not taxing them on that. We only tax it when they draw down the investment and consume it and spend it on a boat or spend it on expensive meals and holidays. That's the kind of thing we should be doing. And the final point, just on net zero, is we should be taxing carbon. That's all we should be doing, right? We shouldn't be doing anything else. The entire net zero policy in this country has forgotten about the net. And so we've given every single civil servant and every single department in the country and every single business in the country the idea that it's their personal responsibility to reduce carbon emissions in the thing they're doing, which is why you get things like windows that don't open properly because of insulation rules and things like that. We should be taxing carbon. Carbon emissions are the problem, and we should be using some of that money to fund R&D in low-carbon technologies so that the world's carbon emissions fall, not just the UK's. That's a great way of solving the problem. Unfortunately, we're doing the exact opposite, and we're going in the wrong direction.
Right, 2 questions very briefly. Thank you, Sam. One from Adrian and one from Alex. Last few minutes.
Yeah, we're moving towards a new era of industrial policy, although why it's industrial, I don't know, but anyway, we're moving towards it. And this seems to be something that's inevitable. What should we do? How should we do it? I want to shift away from whether to how. Since we've been, traditionally very bad at doing this, what should we do? What should we avoid? How should we get out of bad policy if we go down the road to bad policy? And are there any models that you can think of around the world that are relevant to Britain?
Hold that, and let's take Alex's at the same time. Thank you, Adrian.
Hello. Isn't the key that the state should play more of a role in the economy by doing fewer things but doing them better? Because everyone seems to be agreeing that basically, which leads us depressingly back to the Cummings-Adonis chat and some of the other points, that the state is doing lots of things but doing them quite badly. And we want it to play a role, but the role would be doing the things that only the state can do but doing them well rather than what it currently does, which is so many things but almost all of them very badly and quite expensively.
Richard, can you help Adrian with models from around the world that we can learn from?
I think that's. I wouldn't start there, to be honest, because everywhere is, it reflects the political culture of places. I could say Korea's a great model, but Korea started off with General Park having a coup and putting all the industrialists into jail on trumped-up charges, which actually some people might be attracted to, but I don't think it's a great policy.
I knew there was a flaw in the plan.
But I think the focus needs to be on building capability, and so rather than thinking about I'm going to support some existing firm that's close to falling over. It's about building capability, and I think that needs to be thought of coherently. It's about building skills. It's about building supply chains. It's about supporting companies to move into adjacent areas. If you want to get a nuclear supply chain built, you start with companies who have got roughly the right capabilities, and you say, what can we do to support you to move into these new areas? It's about, and I think for the UK, with its current 3%, as I say, 3% economy, I think it needs to, we need to attract foreign direct investment. We need people from around the world who are really good at doing stuff. So we need to get, FDI needs to be about what do you bring to the capability of the region that you come to, rather than how many boring jobs do you provide. So I think that's a different way of thinking about FDI. And I think we need to think very hard about how we scale startups, how startups can stay in the country and grow. And again, I think it's about, and part of that is about finance. It's about talent, other kinds of talent, financial talent and management talent as much as scientific talent. So I think you have to. The policy needs to be specific for the UK because the UK has its own problems. I think we have to take responsibility for the state that we've got into and fix some of those problems.
Hilary, can the SDP live with the Dominic Cummings, Alex Morton philosophy that the state, in direct response to our question, should do less but do it better?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't disagree with that. I think we talked a lot about what the state does. I think the other thing we just need to think about is the rules that the state sets for other people to do work. And I do think that they're actually quite, it kind of keys into what you said. It's the framework that government sets for other people to abide by that I think is one of the real problems that we have. Just one more thing on what you said is that I think that we do need a tripartite partnership between government, the private sector, and our universities to kind of really drive these things forward. It's not one or the other. I think all those people have to work together.
And Mark, final thought from you. If you had one wish that could be granted by a genie about what the government should do better, would it be planning or somewhere else?
Well, so for industrial policy, I don't like the term industrial policy, but you can think of sensible ways in which the government can unlock things like agglomeration benefits
Yeah.
that are being constrained by things like planning. So I was very sympathetic to the Northern Powerhouse idea, some kind of idea of, what can we do to facilitate things happening in Liverpool, Manchester, but not actually try to specify which industries we want in those places. The main problem is whatever industry you have, somebody's going to try and block it, or the homes that are needed for people that might move into the area. So that kind of policy, looking for blockages, you have to have, the state is involved in these areas, so the state must figure out a way of reframing the rules to enable things to happen, instead of blocking them, empowering veto players, and not going down the route, which is what I do see in energy, of actually specifying which technologies we ought to be having in particular areas. So I'm very much with Sam saying that the carbon tax idea is the way to go for energy, not trying to say this should be the mix, because there's very little evidence that governments know what the right mix in the energy sector should be. Very little evidence for that whatsoever.
Thank you, Professor Mark Pennington. Marc Warner, you are a veteran of government procurement. You're going to carry on plugging away. Are you optimistic the process is going to get easier under any change of government?
Definitely not. I mean, for me, the biggest bottleneck to doing anything is always what are the most talented people doing. It's sort of this famous phrase of people, ideas, machines in that order. And upstream of any of these concerns are exactly the thing that Don was talking about, which is there is no chance of fundamental change without fundamental change in the people at the top of government, both in politics and the civil service. And without some way of I would actually add I forget how many systems he said, or how many interlocking problems he pointed to, but there was certainly the sort of civil service. I would add the media in there as well. And that combination of things needs to be unpicked to enable some of the very talented people that are now probably building startups or hedge funds to go into government. And then all of these ideas can propagate out. But trying to fix the actual policies, I think, is only tactical. There'll be some tactical wins, and that's great, and we should do that. But it will only ever be a tactical victory rather than a strategic one.
And final word to you, Sam, as we contemplate the UK's tax burden going higher still.
There are lots of things that we should do, but most of them are much easier in a context of economic growth. So what people in this room should do is focus on the most high leverage policy reforms that people in this room can help affect. Those are, I think, housing reform, related planning reforms around building labs and things like that, probably related planning reforms around infrastructure. I think that's slightly less important than housing, and energy costs. And I think the most likely way to get energy costs down is to reduce nuclear power construction costs. Those two things, I think, would generate quite a significant amount of economic growth, which would make things like NHS reform, police reform, all the other things, civil service reform, all the other things we need to do to get the country working much, much easier to do. And my model is New Zealand. As Roger Douglas said, you have to let the dog see the fox. You have to show people economic growth, and when they experience economic growth, they will be much more willing to do the other things that they need to continue having that.
I've heard that expression in pubs, but it's a rabbit. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Young, we've got Hilary Salt, we've got, Richard Jones, we've got Hilary Salt, we've got Marc Pennington, Marc Warner, Sam Bowman, and myself, Liam Halligan. Thanks so much for listening.